Hi, my name's Andy Fry. I'm here at the TellyCast How to Make Money in Digital event with Andrew Eastel, who is Managing Director of Middlechild Productions. Andrew, lovely to have you here. Can you just give us a sense of why you're here? Why is a traditional TV company here talking to us about digital first?
I think, not to sound too cliche, but it's part of the future of how our businesses are evolving. We're doing more and more of it because we're seeing windows of opportunity in it that perhaps are quite sort of shining lights in an industry that otherwise has been quite dark recently.
Yeah. So give us an idea of some of the things you've done. Obviously you talked about them in the session, but what are the main things you've done in this area?
So we do a range of different things, I guess. So we've made traditionally commissioned digital content for broadcasters, so for Channel 4, for their Untold strand, and for 4 Digital. We also do digital content for the upstream channels, which are run by Passion, and we now run our own brand, which is Gardening with Alan Titchmarsh.
You were very interested in the session talking about how this area can be liberating, but there are also things you lose. Tell us a little bit about the things that you don't have when you move into the area, but also why it's liberating.
I think the things that you don't have, the obvious things you don't have, is necessarily the guarantee of a payday. You know, with a commission in the traditional sense, you don't have a guarantee of viewers and of success of that program, but the commissioning broadcaster has taken the punt with that idea and will pay the money to hope that it works. With this, we're sort of becoming the commissioners. I think in the case of, for example, your own brand like Gardening with Alan Titchmarsh, we are the commissioners, and we are essentially paying for that and taking that risk and spending that time and resources on it with no guarantee of return. However, what you do get is potential sort of security in the future if that does do well. It's your brand to use and your IP to use as you will. And then obviously there's just the time, you have more time to be more nimble with putting content together and publishing it, whereas with a commission in the traditional sense, we're obviously going through significant viewing protocols and processes and compliance protocols. So there's a whole sort of there's a whole great chunk of the stuff which is removed, but obviously you can't just remove that and suddenly have this amazing world where we can do what we want. It's really, really easy, but there's certainly areas that are.
So you've built a channel that's really is working and that has, I think you said, something like 140,000 subscribers. What lessons have you learned, the main lessons you've learned as you've got to this point?
I think the main stuff would be, I think to treat it differently. So to not necessarily just, let me start again, to treat it not entirely the same as something for broadcast, although using the skills that we have as producers in broadcast or in television, they play to our advantage. But the model is, I think, so different that I think you have to be able to change the way you do things to suit that model better, and we're constantly doing that because it is almost a new business. The revenue is different, the staffing structures are different, the roles are different. To be able to do that in the same way, it's quite hard to wrestle the traditional structure of TV production into that mould, and I think it's better to look at it like a new area, not just a sort of something to tag on to linear broadcast material.
Brilliant. A final question. You're moving beyond gardening into new areas. Just give us a quick flavour of what you're doing next.
We're doing pets and survival. 2 areas that, from research, looks like there is space for that content. As in, it's not a saturated market on these on YouTube and on other social media channels, but it's also somewhere that potentially has significant amounts of brands who don't have an awful lot of places to be putting their marketing money when it comes to digital platforms. So fingers crossed, but there's no guarantee, as we've said, that they prove to be as successful as the Alan channel is.
Well, Pets has got to be a winner, hasn't it, really? Very final question. I think you've made a really interesting point a couple of times about how just because a piece of talent has a high profile, they're not necessarily the right piece of talent because maybe they have other commitments. So you've got to do your due diligence on their pre-existing commitments.
Yeah, I think you don't just want to put someone up there and try and get a quick win and a few sort of videos that have got some really high viewer rates. You want to think about how this brand can grow beyond what you're doing in the first place. And if there are limitations to how your brand can grow, i.e. You're working with talent that already has a lot of brand associations, which means that they're committed to not doing or only being able to do certain products, for example, or if they have a really strong social media following in other areas and that area is off limits to you, if they already do a podcast, that kind of thing, then actually commercially you are very limited in what the scope is, and you become really a gun for hire managing and producing, let's say, a YouTube channel for that piece of talent that perhaps needed that, but that doesn't really give you much headroom for growth beyond what you're doing.
I have thought of another question I'm just going to quickly ask you. With the Alan Titchmarsh channel, are you also thinking about how you might introduce new talent, for the day that maybe Alan decides to retire? God forbid that he ever does, but is there an opportunity to grow new talent within the structure?
Well, again, that's a really interesting point, because we are creating brands, not just a one-off series or a one-off film, and there's something brilliant in that, because if we're smart about that, not just with this brand but other brands, then the brand itself can become the selling point. With the Alan example, he is very much the brand, but it's within our control to start bringing in other people if we wish to, or we could create a channel that sits alongside it, from the makers of, that is aimed at a slightly different audience and so on. So all of these things are really exciting because we suddenly can be creative about how that happens, whereas traditionally that's left to the TV broadcasters often, who may have a successful series and then they want to do a spin-off of that and so on, but those conversations often happen away from us. So yeah, I think you have to keep thinking like that. You have to keep thinking about building a community that you can go back to with new offerings, which is the beauty of the digital world at the moment.
Brilliant. Andrew Eastel, thank you for your time and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Cheers for your time.